Okay, well, hello and welcome to this interview on the Avenue YouTube channel. We are thinking today about Christians and submitting to human authority. We occasionally do interviews like this. We did something earlier on during lockdown on plagues and pandemics throughout church history. And this issue of Christians and submission to human authority, it's coming up in our sermon series, looking at the letter of 1 Peter. And obviously, it's a very live issue for us as Christians today, as we live through a time of lockdown in the UK, with government restrictions making a very big impact on people's lives. We think more internationally, we've got the US presidential elections have come and gone, but still are being disputed. Again, the relationship with authority there. We think of recent civil disobedience, again, perhaps in the States, but also over here with the Black Lives Matter movement. So against that sort of background of the world we live in, we want to be asking the questions in this interview. So what does it mean for Christians to submit to human authority? What is the right relationship Christians should have to human authority, to government? And how have Christians wrestled with this question over the past centuries? And so I'm really delighted to have John Coffey with us. John, you've helped us with interviews like this in the past, and it's great to have you here. And you're going to sort of help us for the next few minutes, really just thinking through about just different moments throughout history, and particularly of church history. When have Christians submitted? When have they resisted? What can we learn from them as Christians today? So thank you for joining us, John.
Good to be here.
And John, I'll hand over to you in a second. I guess just the opening question really is, in one sense, our focus today is very much on church history. But obviously the Bible is foundational for Christian thinking. So which biblical texts have been especially important for Christians wrestling with this question of the relationship with human authority?
Well, let me just share my screen to begin with, Richard, because we've got some illustrations to look at to help us on our way. But yeah, I think we need to begin with scripture, because we're going to kind of cover a lot of ground in this interview and cross Christian history and think about the history of Christian political thought over centuries. But Christian political thought is always rooted in the Bible. And the Bible is a very political book. It's full of political narratives, about empires and about kings and palace coups and political exile and so on. It's full of laws, in the Old Testament, of prophets challenging kings and rulers and nations, and prophesying about the fate of nations. So I think sometimes that's obscured for us. And I think one reason is that, A, we don't know the Old Testament as well as previous generations of Christians did. But I think another reason is that we're inclined to spiritualize the Old Testament. To read it in a sort of spiritual way, which neglects the historical meaning of it. And there's nothing wrong with spiritualizing the Old Testament. And in fact, that's how Christians have always read the Old Testament. So, for example, the story of the Exodus. This is the title page of the Geneva Bible, which was one of the Protestant translations of the Bible published in 1560 by English exiles in Geneva. And you can see on the frontispiece, they've got the Israelites at the Red Sea. You can maybe see the pillar of cloud in the background and the Red Sea in front, and the Egyptian army closing in. It's quite small, but hopefully people can see that. And it's interesting why they put it on the front cover of the Geneva Bible. Because on the one hand, they see the Exodus as telling the sort of story of redemption. This is about how God delivers his people from oppression. And it also points forward to Christ. So you see the same picture on the frontispiece of the New Testament, because Christian redemption is seen as exodus from the bondage of sin and Satan. And Christ is seen as the new Moses and, of course, the Passover lamb. So Christians have read the Exodus story in a spiritual fashion. But the Exodus story can also be read politically. It's about the people of God under the authority of a foreign tyrant, of Pharaoh. And it has been read politically throughout Christian history. When Christians find themselves in situations under tyranny and oppression. And that's particularly true, actually, of African Americans. In the 18th and 19th century, they really kind of latch on to the book of Exodus. So the Bible is kind of full of politics. It's written by the Hebrews, who are a marginalized people in the ancient Near East, and who live under the shadow of the great superpowers of the ancient world, of Egypt and Assyria and of Babylon and Persia and of Greece and Rome. And the New Testament as well, of course, is written under the shadow of empires. So it's amazing in a way that the most widely read texts from the ancient world come from, not from the great empires, but they come from this marginalized, often persecuted, exiled, subjugated people. And that means they're very, very rich in the way in which they think about power. So the Bible actually has a lot of reflection on power. And that isn't just in the Old Testament, it's also in the New, of course. We've got a very different situation in the New Testament, because we're not with the early Christians, we're dealing with a community that very quickly becomes a multi-ethnic community. It's not just one ethnic group, and it becomes a diaspora scattered across the Roman world. But the early Christians still face this issue of how you relate to Roman authority. And there are a whole set of different texts in the New Testament that Christians have wrestled with and argued over for centuries, because they could point in different directions. So if you think of Christ saying that we should render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but to God the things that are God, he is suggesting that not everything goes to Caesar, that there is a kind of limit to Caesar's authority. And where you draw that limit has been a kind of big issue. And then there, of course, there's in the book of Acts, we have Peter and the apostles being told to desist from preaching, and they say we should obey God rather than men. Yeah. And then we have these key texts about submission to human authorities. So the most famous one is in Romans chapter 13, which says that everyone should submit to the governing authorities, because the powers that be are ordained or established by God. And there's a text that we're thinking about this week as a church, as we work through 1 Peter, which is saying that we should submit ourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as a supreme authority or to governors. So we have these texts which emphasize submission to authority, but we also have the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation, probably written late in the 1st century against the kind of context of Christian persecution, Christians being persecuted by the empire. And it can be seen as this powerful critique of the Roman Empire as a violent, persecuting body, which is based on economic exploitation, which is depicted as a kind of beast. So Revelation, has been described as one of the most powerful critiques of empire in the 1st or 2nd centuries. So in other words, Christians have a very rich body of thought in the Bible about how the people of God should relate to authorities and to power. But we also Christians have also had to think how we put all of this witness together, because there's a lot of different things going on in the scriptures.
No, that's really helpful, John. And as you say, we'll be looking at the 1 Peter example of that in our sermon this week. But yeah, so I guess we sort of think about, back to maybe to that sort of New Testament church you've alluded to. So the early church, and they didn't enjoy political power. In a sense, again, it was the Roman Empire, and Rome was not Christian at that point. So what can we learn from the first 3 centuries of Christianity about Christians engaging with this issue of when to submit, how to submit, when not to submit to authority?
Yeah, so the early Christians are a minority. At certain points, they're also a persecuted minority, and they're always a sort of vulnerable one. Even around the year 300, there's probably, the population of Christians in the Roman Empire is probably around 5% of the total population. So they don't have much influence at imperial court. So they're very they're disempowered, and there's quite a strong pacifist streak in early Christianity as well. I mean, this is much debated to what extent were the early Christians pacifists, but there certainly are strong pacifist tendencies within the church. In other words, the view that Christians shouldn't participate in violence. They shouldn't participate in the violence of the state or in war. There is some evidence of Christians who are soldiers and in the Roman army, so it's not unequivocal. But early Christianity is very much a minority religion and an outsider religion. It's, on the other hand, there are some ways in which it resists Roman power, and I think one thing that all Christians would accept is that there are limits to human authority. Because human authority is subordinate ultimately to divine authority. There are places human authority cannot go. There are limits to Caesar's power, and there are different ways in which Christians could resist this. We don't have examples in the early centuries of Christians engaging in armed resistance against the powers. They didn't do that. But there are other ways in which you can engage in what's called passive resistance. So sometimes they would resist the orders to renounce their faith or to engage in worship of the emperor, and that could lead to martyrdom. So we have plenty of cases of martyrdom in the ancient world. But they could also resist in other ways. I mean, this is a later depiction of one of the early church fathers, Tertullian. He's one of the most prolific of the early Christian theologians, lived in Carthage in North Africa. And Tertullian writes, one of the things that he does is develop the idea of religious liberty. And so what he in a letter to a Roman governor, he essentially says that the government does not have the authority to impose on people's religion, that the government needs to respect the right of each individual to worship voluntarily as they see fit according to their conscience. And this is in many ways a sort of radical idea, sort of the idea that individuals might have this basic right to worship according to their conscience. But it's one that will have a long track record within Christian thought, and it's a powerful way to say to the authorities, look, there are limits to your authority. You cannot just dictate to conscience, and that's something that political authorities have often been keen to do. And of course, also early Christians could employ the law. And so, we see that in the book of Acts, of course, where Paul is a Roman citizen, and he does appeal to Caesar. He uses his rights as a Roman citizen. So Christians could, in various ways, push back, I suppose, against the overweening authority of the state, even in the early church where they are a very small, marginalized minority.
Yeah. But then, obviously, when Christianity, the 300s, becomes a state religion under Constantine, so how does that change when the Roman Empire becomes sort of Christian? How does that change Christian thinking about politics?
Yeah, so this is one of perhaps the greatest turning point in the history of Christianity, because it goes from being this marginalized, often persecuted minority to becoming, by the end of the 4th century, the state religion. I mean, initially what Constantine does is bring in toleration for Christians. Christians have been fiercely persecuted. Constantine doesn't crack down on paganism initially. He just introduces toleration for the Christians. He brings them in from the cold. But very quickly, Christians go from being a persecuted minority over a century to becoming the established religion of the empire. And that's an enormous transformation. And Christians have argued, especially Protestant Christians, have had fierce arguments about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. So many Christians have thought that this was a good thing because Constantine brings an end to the persecution of toleration, and he starts bringing certain Christian principles to bear on the empire itself. So eventually you get the end of the system of animal sacrifice, for example, which was ubiquitous in the ancient world. You get a challenge to gladiatorial combat in the arenas. You get a certain humanization of the empire. I mean, this is the sort of argument for Constantine. Those who've argued against have sort of argued that Constantine remains more of a sort of imperial dictator than he does a Christian. and that in some ways this corrupts Christianity. It goes from being a sort of more pure religion of the persecuted to being an established religion that's on top. Yeah. So it is an absolutely transformative movement. And there's this book by Peter Leithart called In Defense of Constantine, which has generated a lot of discussion, because that's the kind of the way the debate has developed in recent years. It also opens up, though, a whole tradition of Christian political thought. So Christians from this period on are asking all sorts of fundamental questions about power, because Christians suddenly are in power, so they're having to ask questions about power and authority. One of the key questions is the relationship between church and state. And I think this is perhaps one thing that makes Christian political thought quite different from, say, Islamic political thought, where there's more sense of the unity of the state. In Christianity, there's always this doctrine of the two. There are two authorities. There's civil authority. There's also ecclesiastical authority. And that argument about where the boundaries lie between those two authorities has been absolutely formative for the West, because people who argued for the authority of the church were pushing it back against the authority of the state and saying there are limits to the state's authority. And so it raised really fundamental questions about the authority of civil authorities and ecclesiastical ones. And then there were related arguments about the power of church councils over against the papacy and the power of popular assemblies over against monarchy. And those arguments, which emerge in the Middle Ages, then feed into the modern era and are very, very influential. So what you get in the medieval era is the development of Christian political, very sophisticated Christian political thought, which feeds into really modern states and modern liberal democracies in different ways. So here we've got an image of Charlemagne, the Frankish emperor in the year 800, being crowned by Pope Leo. And it's a very dramatic illustration of the union between church and state. You can see Charlemagne with his sword, and then the scepter of the papacy behind. So it's illustrative of this cooperation between church and state, but there'd also be a great deal of kind of conflict over that as well. And so these figures in the Middle Ages are asking really fundamental questions. And I sometimes like to cite Tony Benn, the late Labour politician, who, whatever you think of his politics, put his finger on what are the key questions in the history of political thought, from sort of Plato and Aristotle through to the present. He used to say there are 5 questions you should ask people in power. What power have you got? Where do you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? Yeah. And those questions are all being asked by the great political thinkers from antiquity, but you see real intense engagement with those sorts of questions in the Middle Ages. And that's something that feeds into the Reformation. I think sometimes as Protestant Christians, we can write off the Middle Ages and think there's nothing to learn from it. But actually Protestants were, the Protestant reformers were in many ways late medieval figures. They were deeply influenced by medieval political thought. And so that feeds into the way that later Protestants think about power.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So I'm just thinking Tony Benn looked like he was really enjoying that pipe. So that's a lovely shot. But yeah, so obviously you're now coming to the time of the Reformation, thinking about sort of Martin Luther and the other reformers. How do they change the picture about this relationship between church and state? Where these Protestant reformers, were they advocates of submission or advocates of resistance? What can you tell us about that period?
Yeah, so one thing to say about Luther, of course, is that one of the reasons Luther's Reformation succeeds is he does have the support of political authorities. Yeah. So he has the protection of Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who's his patron. And without that, Luther may well have ended up on the stake, as previous reformers had done, like Jan Hus, who'd been burned for heresy. So historians talk about a magisterial reformation, a reformation which is supported by the authorities. And that's the Reformation of Luther and Calvin, and the Reformation of England under Henry VIII, and then especially under Edward VI and Elizabeth I. So Reformation succeeds in many countries because it gets the political authorities behind it. And so for that reason, there is an element within Protestant political thought that really emphasizes the power of authority of kings and their right to reform religion and the need to submit to them. And so you see that quite strongly with Luther. Luther does really emphasize the authority of magistrates and the need to submit to them, particularly after the peasants' revolts. There's a huge revolt in Germany in 1525 against the authority of the rulers, led by Thomas Müntzer and others, but it involves hundreds of thousands of peasants, and it's put down at terrible human cost. And some of these rebels have appealed to Luther's ideas of freedom in order to justify their rebellion, and Luther says, no, that's not what I'm arguing. It's very important we submit to the authorities. On the other hand, Luther could also argue that Lutheran states could defend themselves against the emperor, so that it's all right for lesser magistrates to use power against the emperor and defend themselves. So there's an element of self-defense sort of argument within the Reformation. The other thing to remember is that not all the reformers had the support of magistrates, and that there was what we call a radical Reformation. And the radical reformers, the Anabaptists in particular, who practiced believers' baptism, they sort of modeled themselves on the early church. They thought the true church should not appeal to power, and that Christians should be willing to accept persecution. And so there's a very strong strain with the Anabaptists, which flows into the Mennonites, which emphasizes pacifism and non-resistance and the willingness to accept persecution and be a persecuted minority sect. So that's another element of the Reformation that we often forget about. Yeah. But as the Reformation develops in the 16th century, you get the emergence of religious wars between Protestants and Catholics, and that's another very important moment. I mean, here's a famous painting of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572 in Paris, where there was a massacre of 2,000 or 3,000 Protestants in the streets of Paris. There was a fear that the Protestants were about to start a coup, and this leads to this huge massacre. And so France is embroiled by wars of religion. So in a different way, it's the Dutch Republic, which is rebelling against the authority of Spain. And then you get something similar happening in England in the 17th century with the Puritan Revolution. So you have a series of these conflicts in which radical Protestants, especially Calvinists, are fighting against what they see as false religion and idolatry and tyranny. And what emerges from that is a body of quite radical political thought, which challenges the authority of monarchs. And it does so on sort of different grounds. And I've done quite a bit of study of this in the 17th century. I initially was early on in my career sort of working on somebody called Samuel Rutherford, who was a Scottish Covenanter. And I know, Richard, you grew up in a Covenanter Reformed Presbyterian church. So the Scottish Covenanters rebelled against Charles I, and one of their key writers, Rutherford, wrote this book, Lex Rex, or The Law and the Prince, in which he argued that the authority of the law is over the prince, and that it could be legitimate to rebel against the king. Now, one of the problems you had, of course, is what do you do with Romans 13 or 1 Peter 2, which urges to submit to the governing authorities because they're established by God. And he used different arguments. One was that that in Romans 13 it's talking about authorities that are a terror to evildoers, So what do you do if the government's a terror to the good? Yeah. So he sort of suggested that was an issue for those who would argue for complete submission. And he also argued that when you think about the authorities, there are the multiple authorities. You know, there's not just the authority of the king, there's also the authority of Parliament. And so this, what Calvinist resistance theorists, as they're known as, tended to argue is that it's legitimate to resist authority if you have the support of Parliament or the representatives of the people. So it's not legitimate for any private individual to just take up arms and launch a kind of vigilante crusade against the state. That's illegitimate. But where you have a conflict between the authority of the monarch and the authority of the Parliament, Parliament can resist. And they also tended to develop ideas of popular sovereignty. So they would argue the power of kings ultimately comes from God, but it comes to the king via the people. And that what happens is that the people make a covenant with the king, and if the king breaks that covenant, then you can the king can be held to account. You know, so those questions, to whom are you accountable and how can we get rid of you? They said, well, kings are accountable to the people in Parliament, and parliaments can get rid of kings if they don't act according to the covenant of the contract. And that's of course why Charles I in 1649 ends up eventually on the gallows, as you can see in this other depiction.
Okay, yeah. Right. So that's kind of a real grappling with political thoughts, you know, with in relation to kings, to parliament. If we sort of go on a slightly different track in some ways, obviously very much related, just thinking about very recent events in the last sort of 6 months or so, the Black Lives Matter movement really responding to lots of events in the States and then over here and across the world. And I guess that whole issue of race and how Christians have responded to racial slavery, racial segregation, and then how that affects Christians' attitude towards human authority and when it's right to resist, you know, acts of civil disobedience. Just anything of the history of that, thinking about sort of Black Lives Matter. Sort of what does that? How does Christian thought feed into some of those movements and debates?
Yeah. So again, this is something I've been very interested in recent years, working around the history of slavery and anti-slavery and how Christians grapple with the issues and argued actually on both sides about slavery. And one thing I've worked on is the colony of Demerara in South America, where there was a sort of major slave revolt in 1823 centered on this missionary chapel that you can see in this particular picture. But I mean, I think one thing to emphasize, of course, is that most white Christians acquiesced in the system of racial slavery. I mean, you know, we tend to remember those who heroically resisted, but they were a minority, and it was lots of Christians acquiesced with this. I mean, we all know this is true in the American South, but it's also true of a lot of people in the northern the United States. It's also true of a lot of people in Britain. A lot of Christians in Britain had investments in the slave colonies in the Caribbean, and were not supportive of the anti-slavery movement. On the other hand, there develops a tradition of Christian resistance to slavery, and it takes very different forms. So the abolitionist movement resists slavery, but does so non-violently for the most part. And it uses all kinds of mechanisms to protest against the legalization of slavery and Britain's reliance on it. So it protests through petitions. You get mass petitions, many of them signed in churches against the slave trade and then against slavery. You get local committees and organizations formed at the grassroots level. You get speeches and lots of different books and pamphlets and writings being published. Many Christians stop taking West Indian sugar, you know, as a protest against the way in which this is produced by slave labor. So we get some of the earliest fair trade movements are developing in this period. So if you like the tradition of non-violent resistance, is a big part of the anti-slavery movement. But you also get these slave revolts in Demerara and in Jamaica in 1823 and then 1831-32. And what's interesting about those is they emerge from missionary chapels. So this one in Demerara is depicted here. And in the case of Jamaica, it's a Baptist deacon who actually leads the revolt. And there are some really interesting things about that. One is that we know these people are reading the Bible, yeah, and so they're taking some inspiration from the Exodus story, and from other parts of the Bible about oppression and deliverance. They're also strikingly restrained, so especially in the Demerara revolts, although they lock up planters in the stocks and disarm them, there's very, very little violence or killing. Whereas once the revolt is suppressed, hundreds of people are hanged and hanged up on gibbets outside the plantation in reprisals. Jamaica is more violent because they set a lot of the sugarcane fields and the plantation buildings on fire. But again, they're pretty restrained in terms of human life. And I think that's partly again because they're reading the Bible and they're reticent about using sort of violence. So that they're influenced to some degree by the sort of teaching they've heard and by the way they're reading the Bible. But many historians would argue these two revolts were actually very important for the overthrow of slavery. That they have a big impact back in Britain, because when Christians in Britain look at them, they're really, really struck by how these Christian slaves are being maltreated by Christian masters.
Yes.
And there's a lot of sympathy for these figures.
And then I guess thinking about some of the sort of historical implications of that, maybe we think about, again, for a lot of Christians, think about their relationships to someone like Martin Luther King in the States, the civil rights movement, lots of Christians being involved in that in the 20th century. Again, was it very much a case the likes of Luther King were looking back at some of those, Christian thinkers in Jamaica and Demerara? I mean, is there a sense of connection there?
Oh yeah, I mean, African American, the civil rights movement in the 1960s sees itself as connected to the abolitionist movement and to great black activists like Frederick Douglass. The 19th century, Frederick Douglass was absolutely steeped in the Bible. If you read Frederick Douglass's speeches, they're shot through with scripture. And of course, the black church is very, very important to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I mean, once again, it's really important to remember that Christians are on different sides of this argument. A lot of Christians sit out the civil rights movement altogether. The majority of white Christians do, not least the majority of white evangelicals in North America. And some are strongly supportive of racial segregation in the 1960s. So one of the bitter things for King and others who are marching and protesting in the 60s is that that they're often not being supported by white Christians. I mean, there is quite strong support by some of the mainline denominations for the civil rights movement, but it's a very mixed picture. But of course, King believes in resistance, but it's passive resistance. He's quite strongly influenced by his reading of the New Testament. But also by Gandhi and his protest movement in India. So King's is explicitly non-violent as a movement, and it's a very powerful Christian witness for that reason.
Yeah. No, thanks, John. Yeah, I was aware of the funeral in the last few months of John Lewis, one of those, the guys who campaigned alongside Luther King, and very moving stories from that. Okay, well then maybe switching focus a bit to, again, the 20th century, but I guess totalitarian regimes in the 20th century and the Christian sort of relationship with those. So we think about the big examples, I guess, are the Nazi government in Germany, the Nazi regime, or communism with sort of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc. Basically, did Christians under the Nazis, the communists, put up resistance? If so, in what ways did they do that?
Yeah, so I mean, there are celebrated cases of Christian resistance to the Nazis, but But once again, we need to remember that most Christians in Germany did not take the path of resistance. They took the path of least resistance. They acquiesced. Some of them were actually positively enthusiastic. There was a movement of German Christians who were overtly fascist Christians. They actually wanted to abolish the Old Testament, take the Old Testament out of the Bible because it was, too Jewish. Most Christians weren't like that, but a lot of Christians in the middle, if you like, did not put up any fight. So when we talk about those who did resist, they were the minority, and they were very, very brave, of course. And there are some really striking examples. And actually, these figures are very celebrated. We've got pictures here of Sophie and Hans Scholl on the left, and they were students who were part of a group of intellectuals and activists. They were devout Christians, and Sophie Scholl was Lutheran, and this is her brother Hans. And one of the things they did was distribute anti-Nazi literature, which often had Christian arguments within it against Nazi racism and anti-Semitism. And they scattered these around the University of Munich, and they were arrested and actually eventually guillotined. And there is a very powerful film called Sophie Scholl. It's really worth watching, which depicts the whole story, and it's actually quite good on the religious element, religious motivation. And then probably the more famous figure is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German theologian. What's interesting about Bonhoeffer is that he resists all the way through, but he resists in different ways as you track his career. So he early on he has a radio address in which he attacks the Nazi regime, and then he lobbies and works in church elections to stop Nazi sympathetic clergy being elected in the church. He contemplates actually studying under Gandhi at one time. He's engaged in underground seminaries. He leaves in order to avoid military service. He leaves Germany for the United States, and then he returns. And it's only really after he returns in the and then in the early 1940s that he begins to contemplate active or violent resistance. And of course, he's implicated eventually in this assassination attempt on Hitler. And it's interesting, he doesn't really try and justify it. He just says, I will take the guilt of this upon myself. Before other men, he writes, he is justified by dire necessity. Before himself, he is acquitted by his conscience. But before God, he hopes only for grace. Yeah. So he kind of acknowledged that acting violently like this it was a huge step. But nevertheless, it's something he was willing to do. The other example, which has also become a kind of major film recently, is the example of an Austrian called Franz Jagerstatter. I might have pronounced that wrong, but the movie is a Terence Malick film called A Hidden Life, which is described here as cinema at its mightiest and holiest, because actually it does say quite a lot about his religion, his piety. And this is a case of an Austrian man who refused to be conscripted into the Nazi forces. And eventually he is arrested and imprisoned and executed because of his resistance. And it's a very slow movie, but it's very beautiful and powerful film. And I think one of the most striking things about it is the way it depicts his ostracization by his rural community.
Okay.
And everybody else is just going along with this, and he is standing out against it at great personal cost.
Yeah, and that sounds like a description of a lot of Terence Malick films, in a sense. They're slow moving but beautiful. But yeah, I've heard good things about that. That's great. And I guess then, sort of thinking, you moving a bit to sort of other parts of Europe, we think about sort of post-war and communism and the Eastern Bloc, where Christianity was very much under state persecution. Again, any senses of you Christians in those countries in the Eastern Bloc in the 20th century, how they related to human authority and what their response was to that?
Yeah, so I mean, Christians under communism faced tremendous challenges, of course, because the communist authorities were often very hostile to Christianity. Saw it as a kind of relic of the past, you know, there's something that would fade away as communist society came to fruition. And there was a lot of persecution of Christians, though it was, as in the Roman Empire, it was sort of sporadic and at different levels and in different parts of the communist world. And Christians often, authorities and Christians often had to negotiate their relationship. So it's a very complicated thing. So the Orthodox Church, for example, in Russia wasn't completely persecuted out of existence. It still has a presence. It still had some kind of routes of communication through to the communist authorities. Baptist and Pentecostal Christians in Russia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe were much more of a minority, so they were a bit more in a kind of New Testament or sort of early church situation where they had, you know, they had no sort of say. But even they took different views. You know, some would register with the official authorities, others would not. And of course, we've got this situation today in communist China, whereas, you know, some churches are officially registered, others are underground churches, which are therefore more vulnerable to persecution. So you often had real tension between these churches who'd taken sort of different approaches to the authorities. It's worth saying as well that when communist regimes collapsed across Eastern Europe in 1989, it's partly because of religious resistance to them. And that's particularly obvious in Poland, you know, so when Karol Wojtyła, who becomes John Paul II, is elected Pope in 1978, is it? I think the year following in 1979, he goes to Poland and is met by huge, vast crowds. And it's at the beginning, it really inspires some of the resistance to communism in Poland, you know, so the strikes in the great Polish shipyards and so on. In Eastern Europe and places like Romania and Hungary, you get Reform Christians as well, who are sort of part of that movement of critique and resistance. So Christians did play a significant role in the collapse of these Soviet era regimes. And of course, that involves sometimes moving beyond just passive resistance into active resistance, into strikes, into protests, but also sometimes into armed resistance as well in the very latter stages.
No, it's a fascinating picture, John. It really is. And yeah, I remember growing up with reading of Christians in the Eastern Bloc and some of the challenges they faced. John, thank you so much for that. In a sense, there's so much we could say, but that feels like a great sort of whistle-stop tour of a lot of church history relationship with human authority. It's worth advertising that on this coming Sunday evening at Avenue, so that is the 15th of November, I'll say that. We have got for our 5:30 on Zoom, there will be a chance for a Q&A. So in a sense, if you've watched this, you've got questions, you want to know a bit more about some of the things we've been covering, do come along, join us on Zoom at 5:30 on Sunday. And John and I will be there, and we can John will be happy to answer questions and to help people if they want to sort of pursue some of this further. But John, thank you so much for giving your time for this interview. This is, again, a very live issue for Christians throughout history. It is very illuminating here, but also for Christians today. And as we try to, understand that relationship we have with the authorities around us, that's been a real help to learn from brothers and sisters who've gone before us in grappling with these questions. So thanks, John, and we hope you found this time helpful. And do, if you're able to, join us on Zoom on Sunday night for that Q&A at 5:30. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And look forward to discussing it further on Sunday.
Great, John. Thank you. Thanks.